Exegeting the congregation.
Good morning, class. In this section, we're going to be talking about exegeting your congregation. That is, looking at your congregation and being able to tell the groups that are in it. Now, when you're dealing with a typical congregation, you realize you're never dealing with one culture or one kind of people. Every congregation has a variety of different people within it. And what we want to do is to look at some of the subdivisions of people within your congregation and how we can go about developing ways of preaching that will speak to those people. The first kind of subdivision that I want to talk to you about is culture. There is no such thing as a unicultural congregation. Every congregation has many different kinds of cultures and many different ways of relating to cultures. Let's look at some typical divisions within certain kinds of cultures just to see what we're talking about.
Cultural divisions. Here we see the African American culture. Within the African American culture, we may find Jamaicans, Haitians, and Southern-born and Northern-born African Americans. Within Southern culture, we find Appalachians, city-born people, Floridians, Texans, and many other subcultural groups.
Now, within these cultures that we've been talking about that are within your congregation, there's also many different ways in which people relate to those cultures. Sometimes we find people who are trying to get closer into their culture, who are enamored with a culture of a particular kind of culture and are trying to get close to it. For example, African Americans who want to get back to their African roots, or Scottish Americans who want to get back to their Scottish roots, who are seeking ways of becoming more closely related to their culture. There are also people who are in the middle of their culture and have no friends or connections outside of the cultural group of the congregation. Those people seem unaware that there's even an outside world outside of their culture at many times. There are also people who are headed out of their culture, that is, are at least in part rebelling against their culture and really don't want to have anything to do with it. At any one time in a congregation, you're going to find all three of these kinds of people within that congregation. Now, a wise preacher learns how to speak to all three groups. Another kind of division within your congregation is an age division. You'll find that many times people do not respond the way you expect them to with age. For example, it's been my experience that the most resistant people to change are not older people, but younger people quite often. Because young people who are within a culture often don't realize that there's anything outside of that culture, whereas older people have had experience with change and experience with meeting new people and are less frightened by it than younger people. But you need to know the young people in your congregation as well as the old ones, and you need to be able to speak to both. In general, however, I think we can say that older people like to be assured of continuity with the past. It's not that they're afraid of change. They just want to know that you are not taking their memories away from them. And one of the effective ways that you can do that is by appealing to common threads in their past. Young people, on the other hand, like to know that they've got room to grow. So they like to be challenged for the future. They like to be told that they're going to be able to grow. And that's part of what you need to do for them. Another kind of distinction that happens within your congregation are class distinctions. They are often not obvious to the eye and not obvious to the new preacher coming in. But in every congregation, regardless of the culture, there exist three kinds of class distinctions: the working class, middle class, and upper class. Sometimes churches are predominantly working class, sometimes predominantly middle class, sometimes predominantly upper class. It's important that you know the distinctions. This chart will help you understand them.
Here we see a representation of classes within America. Let me caution and say that this has nothing to do with how much money a person earns, but it has to do with upward mobility. The working class does not expect to rise above their current social status. Therefore, they value safety and security above all. They are loyal followers of others, but seldom take leadership themselves. They expect authoritarian leaders. They want somebody who will tell them what to do and what to think, and they do not plan very far ahead in their lives. Middle class people are distinguished by their upward mobility. They have hope that they will rise higher and that their heirs will rise higher than they did. Therefore, they are very concerned about their appearances and try to look good so that they will be upwardly mobile. They value education, exercise, and other things that help them move up in upward mobility. They appreciate leadership, but they also want to share within that leadership themselves. Upper class people are sometimes called the invisible class because it's hard to spot them from the middle class or sometimes even the working class. They plan far ahead in their life for generations. They seek by their wealth and their status to influence everything around them, hopefully for the good, and at the same time to preserve their wealth for their heirs.
Another distinctive within a congregation has to do with the mission of the church and the way they perceive the mission of the church.
The mission model of the church divides along two axes. The first axis is low outreach and high outreach. Churches or individuals within churches who do not favor outreach beyond the church and those who do. The second axis we'll call low commitment and high commitment. Now, the first quadrant of that is what I call the parish church. This is a high outreach, low commitment church. It sees the entire community as the parish. It sees very little difference between Christians and non-Christians and seeks to influence the world to make it a better world to live in. Not necessarily more Christian, but more socially aware and socially pure. And the high commitment, low outreach quadrant is what we call the purified church. This is generally a reaction to the parish church. They definitely believe that Christians need to be committed to Christ and not simply be socially active individuals. But their emphasis is on the purification of the church, and so therefore they're low outreach and not high outreach. The third quadrant, the low outreach, low commitment group, is called the family church. Like the parish church, they don't emphasize personal conversion. Instead, they emphasize what's good for the small group of people who are already in the church, the family. These are the traditionally ingrown church. However, they usually are good about taking care of themselves. The last quadrant is the missional church. These are high commitment, high outreach churches. These are the ones that emphasize a high commitment to Christ and a high interest in the lost and the hurting people everywhere. And the missional church looks like the strongest in many ways is. Nevertheless, it needs to draw from the family church a desire to take care of their own people.
A fifth distinction within the church has to do with their relationship to the culture at large. Are they pre-modern, modern, or postmodern culture Christians? We're going to talk in depth about that, but let me illustrate it through this chart.
Modern culture has been moving historically between pre-modern and postmodern culture. Pre-modern culture is symbolized by a cross and by faith because it has to do with faith. Modern culture emphasizes reason. Postmodern culture emphasizes story. Pre-modern culture is faith-based. That is, it believes that we learn things by them being handed down to us from God. It speaks mainly in images and symbols. It is a pre-literate culture in a lot of ways. It believes in supernaturalism. In other words, it believes in miracles and spirits. It is a God-ordered universe in pre-modern culture. Modern culture, on the other hand, which I symbolize using a tree, which represents the leaves and branches orderly going together, is reason-based. Everything can be deduced and grows from earlier deductions. Its main means of communication is written text. It believes in naturalism. It rejects supernaturalism as an explanation for anything. It believes in a logically ordered universe. Postmodern culture I have symbolized by a bowl of alphabet soup. Anything you see in it is what you make of it. It is a relativistic worldview. Movies and stories make up the myths and legends that provide the basis for postmodern culture. Any meaning that you find in culture is human imposed. And any order you see in the universe is what you make of it, or what we make of it. There'll be a lot more to say about postmodern culture later.
As you can see, there are very many different kinds of Christians within what even appears to be a one culture church. It's important that you as pastor relate to them all. One of the best ways that I can tell you to do that is that as you prepare your sermon, imagine the many different kinds of people that you have in the church sitting around you, talking to you, asking you questions, and asking them particularly this question: what does this mean to me? How does this relate to my life? A wise pastor learns to relate his sermons to the life of the people that are before him, not just to himself,